at Edelman, we've been doing this trust barometer for 16 years. This is the heart and soul and passion of our CEO, Richard Edelman. And what that has involved is the global state of trust in 4 institutions, not only in the United States, but globally, and more recently we've been doing cuts in different states. Those institutions include business, government, media, and NGOs. And I want to just take a pause because what this has done is it has shaped and informed the way we at Edelman work when it comes to dealing with issues of converting critics. We spend a lot of time working with our clients on establishing trust as an asset, because that asset, not only does it build relationships, but it can also inoculate you from critics in the future, because any organization is going to have a misstep. That's the reality of the world we live in, never more so than now. But so the key findings of this year's trust barometer, and I'm going to get into a little bit more detail. One, we've seen that trust rebounds to the post-recession high, but the divide widens. So what we're seeing is a greater divide between what we call the informed publics and the mass population. Informed publics being individuals in countries across the world and the United States that are in the top 25% income bracket, college educated, and consumers of media and information. The other 85% is who we're calling the mass audience and mass population. We've seen that inequality in trust, and let me just remind you, we're talking about trust in 4 institutions, the gap and the growing inequality in trust between these two audiences is bigger than it's ever been before. And think about what that means for your business and for your work, because if the audiences you're dealing with, especially when you have to convert a critical or cynical audience, already don't trust what you have to say or are operating in a world where there's not a lot of trust, that's even another hurdle that needs to be addressed. We've seen the inversion of influence, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but not so long ago, the perceived elite had all the authority because there was a perception that only they had access to the important information that then trickled down. And now what we see is that authority lives in the masses. We also know that the widening trust gap is creating opportunities for business to lead. And that's critically important to understand when you're converting skeptics and critics, and especially when you're dealing with an issue or a crisis for a client. And finally, what I'm going to share with you is that leadership in a divided world, and I call that divided world the inversion we've seen in influence, is misaligned. There is a huge opportunity for CEOs and business to lead, but they're not always focusing on the right thing. So let's just get into a couple of the details here. So this is just a quick overview of how we've seen trust in institutions evolve between 2012 and 2016. So you can see that what we're seeing, the most interesting thing that I find, is that after a dip in media for 2015, we're starting to see an increase in trust in media. But let me be clear, that dip in media, that trust in media is in search and in peer-to-peer recommendations, not growth in the traditional media formats, okay? And I'm going to get back to that in just a moment. This is just to kind of give you a quick glance at how we see the double-digit gaps and disparity between informed publics and mass audiences when it comes to the inequality of trust. And I want you to notice that the United States, between 20 and 12, in 2012, that gap was 11 points. In 2016, it's 19. That's huge. From a statistical perspective, that's a really, really big gap. And you'll notice that most of the countries that I'm referring to here are somewhat developed countries. Below the less developed countries, and interestingly enough, countries that don't have a traditional democracy, you don't see this gap, which starts to bring into question what's happening with the power and the beauty that has been democracy. This data starts to ask, is the power of democracy, the collaboration, the perceived equality that is a democracy, the trust in government, is it eroding? Are we moving to a darker place? The phenomenon is global, so this is not unique to the United States. But what is interesting is, as bad as it is worldwide, it's even worse in California. So in California, the inequality of trust is even more significant than the rest of the United States. And what we know is that that inequality is linked to income. So one of the findings that I'm not going to get into a lot of detail tonight is the impact of the tech sector in the state of California. So while the tech sector has brought economy and opportunity to our state, it's also contributed to a growing perception that there's haves and have-nots, and only some people are benefiting from this economic equality. And if you think for a second, if you live in the Bay Area or in Los Angeles, which are the two areas we sampled, think about the impact of real estate prices alone. Think of the issue of homelessness. In Los Angeles, the three biggest issues we identified were drought and homelessness and real estate. So now you can start to see where this inequality gap is going and how that affects the companies and the clients that we're doing work with. What we see in addition to the link to income inequality is that the growing inequality gap by the mass public also shows that there's not a whole lot of optimism about what the next 5 years hold. So what this question asked is, do you think that you will be better off in 5 years? And the majority of the mass audience public in the state of California, in the country and globally said no. The elites said yes. And the California tech sector is driving these gaps in inequality. But what's really interesting is that 78% of people who are considered quote-unquote wealthy believe that the growth in the tech sector in California is benefiting the wealthy, whereas 30% of the quote-unquote middle class, 43% believe that the middle class has been harmed. I found this statistic really interesting. More than 3 in 4 Californians place themselves at the lower end of the income spectrum, with very few people believing that they're getting ahead. But I want you to realize that 1 in 3 of those individuals made more than $100,000 a year. And they think they're at the bottom of the income spectrum. So you can see that there's reality and there's perception. We have this incredibly divided, fragmented authority and inequality trust gap. And now add in the growth and influence of peer-driven media. And what we see is that more and more people get to consume media that reflects a point of view they've already established, which reinforces a perception and the polarization of their reality. So how much is real and how much of this is perceived? And if you're an organization, how do you address this peer-driven media? We now know that that every voice matters, but the most authoritative voice for public audiences is my friends and family and employees of a company. So I want you to think about that, okay? You have a company and they're in crisis, and the CEO comes out and says, we're going to fix it. But the employees say, no, he's not fixing it or she's not fixing it. Who are they going to believe, the CEO or the employees? So you can see how this can potentially inform your strategies and your communications going forward. And then when we talk about my friends and family, search is the most influential of all the media that we're seeing. So a great example is what's happening on Facebook. More and more people get their original media from Facebook. Well, if that's not curated in advance, based on what you're already reading, how wide of a perspective and point of view are you really getting? Think about the role of media. They're the fourth estate. They were created to keep our institutions open, honest, and transparent. But how does that happen when the curation is happening because of what you're reading or because what's being shared? So this leads me to our conclusion tonight, which we've seen a huge inversion of influence. The old model was elites have more access, elite interests are interconnected with those of mass audiences, and becoming an elite, which is what California and the United States stands for, is open to everyone. The new reality is that authority lives with our mass audiences, that information is democratized, that high-profile revelations of greed and behavior and misbehavior can completely undermine an organization, hence the need to lead with trust and values. So to embrace this new reality, what we like to share with our clients is the fact that you need to create societal impact in addition to profits. Right? We all want to follow a CEO that's making money for the company, but it's not enough anymore. The CEO has to lead with trust, societal impact, good. That's the demand and the license to operate, and the employees have to believe and get in line, because if they don't, you are not trustworthy. You need to express your values through honest, ethical engagement when you share your stories. Our findings found that people want to hear the CEO's personal story. If you're going to make your CEO the spokesperson, that CEO better be willing to be transparent with their story. And quite frankly, that kind of gets back to our old school PR. Are there any skeletons in your closet? Because if there are, let's uncover them now. Let's not let them seep out. Because now when they seep out, it's really hard to put that beast back into the bag or that cat back in the bag. Your employees are your most powerful advocate. And to Dave's point, engage cross-channel to meet your stakeholders where they are about what concerns them. Think of the narrative, think of your story, think of the pillars of communication, and think how you're going to connect with these audiences. And finally, what I want to leave you with is business has an opportunity to lead more than they ever have before. Trust in business is higher than it's ever been, right? More than 80%, up from 74%, believe that business can lead. But they need to lead without the short-term focus on profits. They need to have a long-term view where trust has increased is when a company is producing economic growth, is contributing to the greater good, and allows its employees to be a productive member of society. Yes, financial metrics matter. Of course they matter. But the rest of it is the rest of the story. That was fast, and it was a lot, so thank you for your time.